Hello everyone, and welcome back to Model Building with Terry. We are back with our submarine, with the U-81. And last time we left off, it's been a while, I was actually just doing some painting on the hull and on the deck. And at this point, I think today, during our little fire chat, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get these out from their sprues and see if we can fit the hull together, because this was the first paint coat that I wanted on this thing, and let's see how this goes. I generally I have a little set of pliers to cut these, because you just want to make sure you've got something really sharp, that you're not breaking off any of the small bits that might be connected from the casting, and just saves you a lot of filing if you do it like this. So now that we've done that, we can also pull the tape off and actually see what our paint looks like. So while I'm pulling things apart, there was something that I was wondering, and I'm doing this for relaxation, and my thoughts tend to wander when I'm doing these things. So I was wondering. Given how successful the submarines were in the Atlantic and how relatively unsuccessful the surface raiders were, so all the major warships that were on the surface and were supposed to be commerce raiding didn't really have an enormous amount of success, whereas the submarines, especially at the onset of the war, were actually really, really successful. So how come, did the Germans not know that? Did the Germans not understand that? Because surely they were aware that if they were going up against Great Britain, which is a great naval power, that the only way they could defeat the British, because they didn't actually have enough of a fleet, the only way they could defeat the British would be by cutting off their supply lines, which makes sense. And the best way of doing that would have been the submarines. So how come they didn't actually have sufficient amount of submarines? Why didn't they go all out with the submarines? Now it turns out we've got to go a little bit back to the contract of Versailles after this, which ended the First World War, and which basically prohibited the Germans from having pretty much any military to speak of whatsoever. In terms of navy, they were allowed no submarines and just a couple of outdated ships. Now the Germans obviously weren't very happy about this, but all German governments after the end of the First World War were more or less breaking this. They did this with the tanks and declared them as tractors, as far as I remember. But with ships, they did actually start building them. And the British were somewhat aware of this. They were aware that the Germans were rearming, and they were also trying to kind of play the middleman between the French and the Germans in all the negotiations about this part of the Versailles contract. And, saying, look, they do need a little bit more in terms of navy. The French obviously were completely opposed to that. But the British realized that the greatest threat that the Germans would pose to the British if war would break out was not going to be a fleet that was actually more powerful than the British. Because, they tried that in the First World War and didn't go so well. They had a lot of building to do to get to that point. And the British themselves were somewhat hampered by the naval agreement in Washington and London, by these treaties, because their whole shipbuilding industry was, didn't really have much to do, because they were building a lot of ships in the interwar period. So they were somewhat scared that somebody would just start up and outbuild them. And when it came to the composition, the British were very aware that if the Germans were building a cruiser fleet, and a cruiser submarine fleet, basically, that was geared towards commerce raiding, that this would be the biggest threat in case of war that they would have. So what they did, they actually decided to have a chat with the Germans, because Adolf Hitler, once he was in power, didn't actually plan to attack the British from the beginning. He wanted to kind of, have a form of alliance with them, and decided, okay, the Germans get the continent, like with France and Russia and Eastern Europe and everything. And the British can keep the seas as an ocean empire. So this way he wouldn't have to fight the British. And, everybody could, he would probably want to fight the British eventually, but in the beginning he wouldn't have to. And the British were, on the diplomatic front, very confused about Hitler's actual intentions, and were giving him the benefit of the doubt. Well, that didn't work out so well, but hindsight and everything. So they thought, okay, sure, we'll get into an agreement with the Germans, such that the Germans can build up to 35% of the fleet of the British in size and in tonnage, provided that it is a fleet of a similar composition. So the Germans couldn't build a fleet that, as it was, would actually be able to challenge the British. They couldn't also build the fleet that they really should have been building, which was heaps of submarines, because these things were cheap to build, and a lot of cruisers. So the Germans, though, were, especially Hitler, was so much into the prestige of large surface ships in the beginnings that he really wanted to have a mixed fleet that would resemble the composition of the British. So while the French were absolutely furious about this whole thing, because it basically broke Versailles and all the other naval treaties, because it was just between the British and the Germans. But while this was politically a bit of a disaster for the British, it was also strategically actually working out pretty well for them, because it meant that at the outbreak of the war, when Hitler realized that, no, we're not going to have an alliance with the British, we're actually going to be at war with the British, the Germans didn't have the right fleet composition to deal with the British. So this is how that all came to being. Now, back to my actual submarine. It's not very large, but the amount of detail is pretty nice actually on this. And if you remember from last episode, I have chosen a bit more of a dark blue color for the deck. I'm still going to use some black wash on this later on, once it's completely assembled, to give it a bit more of a worn-out, war-worn look. All right, that seems to be all fitting pretty well. So let's get to gluing. I'm using a Revel cement, and given that I've literally just picked that up, after quite a bit of a pause, I'm trying to glue, and it turns out that the cement has dried out and is actually not coming out of the thing. So I gave myself a tissue just to try that and see what's going on, but it looks like it is completely and utterly stuck. Now, I've been in this situation before. And one trick that I've learned from my local model building shop is that you can actually use a lighter to heat up and burn out the stuck glue. So especially if you have something with a metal needle-like extension there that isn't going to melt. You obviously can't do that on plastic, but the glue in there is just hardened. So if you heat it, if you heat it with a lighter, it'll actually melt. And since it's pretty flammable, it'll actually flame out at the front. And that way you can clear these without having to replace them, which I've done already once or twice, and is really a nice way of going about this. So if you've got an old modeling glue that has dried up, this is a relatively easy way. Just make sure you're ventilating the room pretty well, because that stuff is not particularly good for your health. And here we go. Glue is all refurbished and back in operation. So I'm just going to drop some onto the hull and actually get the holes together first. I have to be a little bit careful with spills. But again, because I've only put one coat on, even if I spill a little bit, and the glue has a tendency to mess with the paints. If I do spill over a little bit, it's not a big drama, because I'm still going to put a second coat on this anyway. The first one is just because it's easier to do the first coat while the thing is still in its casting frames. So the final coat will come once everything's glued together and cover up all the seams and all the bits that I don't really want to be showing up. And you don't really know that beforehand anyway. So, but especially with the smaller parts, it's a lot easier to paint them before you assemble them. I tend to do this. I tend to do that just like that, and then I can do a touch up afterwards. So let's see if we can glue that together. Now remember that I had the painter's tape from the original paint job, and I'm just going to use that to hold the two halves of the hull together, such that the glue can dry. Now I'm not going to tape it all the way around yet, because I'm still going to want to put the deck in. The reason I'm putting the deck in already is because it's entirely possible that when I'm, compressing the whole parts together, they're not going to fit the deck anymore afterwards. Or they're going to be too large, and the deck is not going to fit in and going to fall through. So I want to put all three together and then just rub the tape all the way around. So the hull has dried a little bit up, so we can actually fit the deck in now. And it still fits perfectly. It's not too loose, it doesn't fall through, and it's not too tight that I have to spread it out. It's better to be too tight, to be honest, because otherwise it's going to be really tricky to glue the deck in. It has slight ridges around the side, so it's relatively easy with this thin pointy glue extension to just glide along the sides of the ridges, go through that, and then set that into the hole. And there we go. Now we're just going to wrap the tape around, just to make sure that everything stays in place and we're not leaving any gaps in between things. And then I can set that aside to rest and dry. And once that's completely cured, the next thing is probably going to be to stick the conning tower and some of the other deck parts onto it, plus the screws, the rudders, and all these kind of things. So that's that for today. Thanks everybody. I hope you have a good weekend. And I'll see you next week with more World of Warships, don't worry. Have a good one, bye.